Welcome back to the deep dive. We all know that feeling, right? You've got this mountain of stuff to read, articles, reports, even your own notes piling up. And you just wish there was a way to cut to the chase, to figure out what truly matters, like right now.
Well, that's where we come in. Consider this your express lane through the information overload.
Exactly. And today's deep dive, well, it's a rich one. We're taking on a collection of essays by no other than Peter F. Drucker. He's quite a thinker, to say the least.
A giant in the field. And these essays, they span a whole decade of his work, all collected in this book, Peter F. Drucker on Nonprofits in the Public Sector. Came out as an ebook back in April 2020.
And you know, the thing that really ties all these writings together, the common thread, is this idea he calls social ecology. Sounds kind of complicated, but really it's about how all these institutions, governments, businesses, schools even, how they shape our lives, how we live, what we value, how we make a living. It's all connected.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the essays you've sent our way, they tackle some pretty big current concerns, is how he put it. Stuff that was on everyone's mind back in the late 70s, early 80s. Everything
Right.
from, the environment and what retirement would look like in the future to technology, the role of these huge multinational companies, the nuts and bolts of management, even the link between science and industry. And then it all culminates in this fascinating look at Japan.
It's a bit like taking a time machine back to the big debates of that era. But here's the thing about Drucker. He wasn't just chasing headlines, He was looking for those deeper patterns, trying to find what he called the permanent through the transient. So that's our mission today. We're going to dig into these essays and try to unearth those nuggets of insight, the stuff that still resonates today, years later. The things that can give us that, as Drucker put it, self-knowledge, of immediacy, of direct understanding.
Let's get started then. So, where to begin with this treasure trove of ideas?
Well, I'd say the first section of the book, where Drucker lays out his vision toward the next economics, is a pretty good starting point.
Okay, the next economics. Catchy title. Sounds a bit like a sequel. So what's the premise here?
Well, he argues that a new way of understanding economics was emerging, something he calls it post-Keynesian, which basically means building on but also moving beyond the theories of, the famous economist John Maynard Keynes.
All right, so that's our starting point. But before we go too far, why did Drucker think the old economic models, the pre-Keynesian stuff, wasn't cutting it anymore?
You see, he felt that while those earlier theories, whether it's neoclassical economics or even Marxist economics, they still had their uses, they offered some tools, but the way we viewed the economic world, the whole lens, had been fundamentally shifted by Keynes. It was like a paradigm shift, or as Drucker put it, a scientific revolution. Kind of like how physics had to be rethought after Einstein. The old rules just couldn't fully grasp the economic realities of the time. And he even goes back further, right, talking about mercantilism and the physiocrats. What's the point of bringing up those old economic systems?
Well, I think it's to highlight how economic thought has evolved, how each system tried to tackle the big issues of its day, but ultimately, while they had their limits, like take mercantilism, that was all about boosting a nation's wealth through exports, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it ran into problems, big problems, when it couldn't solve this productivity crisis that was happening. For example, France, they had all these mercantilist policies, but they just couldn't keep up with England's savings rate.
Yeah, so then the physiocrats came along. They're the ones who put the focus on land as the real source of wealth, right?
Exactly. And in doing so, they sparked what Drucker calls a scientific revolution in economics. They questioned this age-old idea that wealth was just about money. Back then it was all about specie, which basically meant gold and silver coins. But they looked around and saw France, a country swimming in gold, yet struggling with poverty. So they said, hold on, there's got to be more to it than this. And they shifted the focus to land. They said, that's where the real value comes from. And that was huge. That was the first real theory of economic value. And that's what made economics a distinct discipline.
Okay, so we've got mercantilism, then the physiocrats, and then boom, Keynes enters the scene. What's the big shakeup that he brought to economics?
Keynes, as Drucker explains it, he kind of shifted our attention away from the real economy, the goods and services, the tangible stuff, and put the spotlight on the symbol economy of money and credit. His big insight was that during those nasty recessions in the 1920s, labor unions in England, they were treating their wages, the money they earned, as their actual income, even though, inflation was eating away at their purchasing power.
Mm-hmm.
So Keynes, he realized that maybe we've been looking at this the wrong way. And he proposed this revolutionary idea that monetary factors, Things like the money supply, credit, interest rates, those were the real drivers of economic activity. It was a big deal. It's like saying the actual stuff we make and buy is less important than the flow of money itself.
Definitely a different way of thinking about things. But then Drucker points out a potential flaw in this whole Keynesian approach, right? This idea of what he calls the economist king. So what's the problem there?
Well, the Keynesian model, it relied on this idea that there would be this objective, all-knowing expert, the economist king, who'd make decisions based purely on data and logic, no politics involved. But then came the post-war inflation, especially in Europe, and it showed that, well, sometimes politics trumps economics. You might have the smartest economists in the room, knowing exactly what needs to be done to control inflation. Often it meant cutting government spending, But if the politicians don't have the will, the guts to do it, then those solutions are just, well, ideas on paper.
So it's not enough to have the right answers. You also need the political power to put them into action.
Makes sense. Okay, so if these older economic models had their issues, what did Drucker see as the defining features of this next microeconomics he was predicting? Well, he lays out a few key characteristics. The first one is this emphasis on optimizing productivity, rather than just blindly trying to maximize output, which is what a lot of the older models focused on. He's saying we need to look at the bigger picture, how different economic activities are linked. For example, generating capital. It requires covering the costs of that capital. And that's just one example of those connections.
Makes sense. So it's not just about producing more, but producing smarter. What else?
Another key feature is this idea of satisficing profit. Now, that might sound a little odd, but it basically means not necessarily aiming for the absolute highest profit possible, but rather a level that is, well, sufficient, good enough, especially considering that the minimum cost of capital might be higher than traditionally assumed. It's more like aiming for a healthy profit that allows you to achieve other goals as well, things like sustainability or taking care of your employees.
Satisficing instead of maximizing. That's an interesting concept. What else did he see as part of this next economics?
It would also need to be dynamic. That means acknowledging and embracing the reality of risk and uncertainty. The fact that things are constantly changing, whether it's due to technology, shifting economic conditions, you nail it. The future is unpredictable. But even within that uncertainty, it should still aim for some kind of equilibrium, finding ways to incorporate that unpredictability into testable behaviors in the present. And Drucker points out that some economists, guys like Frank Knight and GLS Shackle, they had already started to grapple with this, trying to figure out how to balance the need for certainty in economic analysis with the inherent uncertainty of real-world economic policies.
So a more complex, more nuanced way of thinking about economics. All right, that gives us a good overview of Drucker's economic thinking. But let's switch gears now. Let's move from the world of money to, well, the natural world, the environment. Drucker wrote this essay, a rather provocative title, Saving the Crusade, the High Cost of Our Environmental Future. It almost sounds like a warning.
It is, in a way. See, he recognized that even back then, environmentalism had a lot of support. People were concerned. But he was also saying, look, this environmental crisis, it's the result of us ignoring the real costs for way too long. Those costs, they've been piling up, and now we're going to have to pay the price. Literally. He's talking higher prices, more taxes for both consumers and producers. It's unavoidable.
He does mention that new technologies, things like waste recycling and energy efficiency, those could potentially help, even turn some environmental problems into opportunities. But the bottom line is those increased costs, they hit us right now, right?
Absolutely. And he takes on this common idea that just chasing profit will somehow magically solve the environmental crisis. Or this other notion that we just need to scale back industry, produce less stuff. And he argues, especially given that in the decade after the baby boom, there's going to be this huge wave of young people entering the workforce, starting families. They're going to need jobs. They're going to need goods. If we hit the brakes on the economy too hard in the name of the environment, well, there's a real risk of creating a backlash. People will turn against the very idea of environmental protection if they see it as a threat to their livelihoods.
So he's actually saying we need a healthy economy, maybe even some growth, like around 4% annually, to prevent that backlash and keep the environmental movement going strong. That's not what you usually hear from environmentalists.
It's a more nuanced view, for sure, and it was quite controversial at the time. But he believed that a strong economy gives us the resources, the breathing room, to tackle these environmental challenges in a sustainable way. And he also stressed the need for positive incentives, making it worthwhile for people to do the right thing. He called it making virtue pay. Don't just rely on laws and regulations, which can feel like punishment. Create a system where doing good for the environment is also good for your bottom line.
Okay, so incentives matter. Now, he also brings up this really specific case study, an environmental crime. It's about this Union Carbide plant in Marietta, Ohio. Why this particular example? What's the point he's trying to make?
Well, it's a great illustration of these complex trade-offs he's talking about. See, this plant, it was initially considered a pioneer in environmental responsibility, but then it became a major polluter, caused all sorts of problems for the neighboring town, Vienna, West Virginia. And when they finally started cleaning up the mess, it led to a bunch of jobs being lost, right, in an area that was already struggling economically. And this raises some really tough questions, like what happens when environmental regulations force a plant to close? What about government subsidies to help these companies clean up? Should environmental standards be relaxed in areas that are already hurting economically? It's not as simple as saying pollution is bad, end of story. There are real people's lives and livelihoods at stake.
It definitely adds another layer to the whole debate, and he takes this even further, right, looking at the challenges of what he calls third world ecology, the environmental issues faced by developing countries.
He points out that for many of these countries, industrialization is seen as the key to lifting people out of poverty. But often, that means relying on industries and technologies that, well, we in the developed world now consider ecological villains. Things like power plants, fertilizers, cars, steel mills. And it creates this real dilemma. Should developed nations be pushing for immediate pollution reduction in these countries? Or should we accept that some level of pollution is the price of development, at least in the short term? And how do you even have this conversation without sounding like you're dictating terms to these countries? It's a minefield.
Yeah, it touches on that whole issue of, environmental concerns versus national sovereignty. Who gets to decide what's best for these countries?
Exactly. Pollution doesn't respect borders, right? Yeah. But each country has its own priorities, its own path to development. And Drucker also points out the role of the U.S. in all of this. He says, look, we're one of the biggest polluters out there. People are watching us. We need to set an example. And he emphasizes the importance of international treaties, global cooperation, to prevent what he calls a race to the bottom, where countries just keep lowering their environmental standards to attract businesses and gain a competitive edge. It's a real danger.
And then he gets into this really tough part, what he calls choosing the lesser evils. The situations where you have to weigh environmental risks against basic human survival needs.
He gives some stark examples, like the lack of safe alternatives to pesticides in some parts of the world. So you're forced to choose between potential environmental damage and the risk of famine. Or, deforestation versus widespread insect infestations that can destroy crops. These are tough choices, and there are no easy answers. He's saying we need a coherent, long-term strategy with public buy-in, and we need to be honest about the fact that we can't do everything at once. There are going to be painful choices, and there will be costs, both financial and human. And those costs, they're often going to fall hardest on the poor and developing countries.
These are weighty issues, no doubt. And what's striking is how relevant they still are today, decades later. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about something that's pretty central to our modern world, technology. Drucker wrote this essay called Business and Technology, where he starts off by saying something kind of surprising. He says, look, technology's everywhere, it's in the news constantly, but there's this strange lack of deep understanding about it, or even how to manage it effectively. And this is true even within the business world, which is supposed to be all about innovation, right?
He points out that even fields like economics, history, sociology, they tend to treat technology with this benign neglect at best, or even outright disdain. And then there's a business world. So many business leaders, they don't really seem to grasp technology at a deeper level. And this is baffling to Drucker because, as he puts it, modern business is essentially a creature of technology.
So he traces that connection, right? How technology gave birth to factories, these massive enterprises like railroads. And then over time, businesses themselves became creators of technology through R&D, research and development. But he's careful to point out, it's not enough to just have the technology. It only becomes truly impactful, what he calls innovation, when it's effectively put into action by businesses.
Exactly. And he criticizes this common view of technology as this unpredictable force, something you can't really control. And he questions this tendency to keep R&D, the innovation part, separate from the day-to-day operations of the business. He argues that, look, you can't manage technology in a vacuum. The whole business needs to become an innovative organization. You need to be able to adapt to technological change, but also to social and economic shifts. And that requires changing your structure, your policies, your whole mindset.
And he's also saying, hey, business leaders, you have a responsibility here. It's not just some vague social responsibility. It's about owning the impact of your technological choices, the consequences for individuals, for society as a whole, for the economy.
He makes this comparison to what he calls the heroic age of invention, which was between 1856 and 1911, a period of just incredible breakthroughs, new industries popping up left and right. And he's suggesting that the next few decades, they were going to see a similar rate of technological change. And he warns those traditional businesses that treat technology as this external thing. He says, you're facing a deadly threat if you don't adapt. But for those who embrace technology, see it as a tool and also a responsibility, well, there are huge opportunities.
And he's very clear about the distinction between technology, which is the knowledge, the know-how, and innovation, which is the actual impact that technology has on our economic capabilities. It's not just about having cool gadgets. It's about how those gadgets change the way we do things.
And he cautions against trying to predict specific technological breakthroughs, trying to be like Jules Verne. Because even Verne, who got a lot of things right, well, he got plenty wrong too. And for every Verne, there are countless others who made predictions that just flopped.
He's saying it's more about understanding the broader trends, the forces at play. And he suggests a more practical approach to spotting potential innovations. He says, ask yourself, what are we afraid of? What are the things that keep us up at night? Because often those are the areas where current solutions are failing. And to truly innovate, we need to acknowledge those failures, not just pretend they don't exist.
And he makes a really important point about the role of business leaders in all of this. He says it's not just about throwing money at research and hoping something good comes out of it. It's about understanding new knowledge, figuring out its potential impact, and then actively translating it into practical technologies, whether it's new processes or products. And that requires a different kind of mindset, what he calls a technologist mindset. It's about seeing the bigger picture, looking beyond your narrow area of expertise. Because often, the most groundbreaking innovations, they come from combining knowledge from completely different fields. He even suggests that sometimes someone with a broad intellectual curiosity, even if they don't have deep technical knowledge, can be more effective at driving innovation than a highly specialized scientist.
And he gives some fascinating examples, like how DDT and antibiotics combine with things you wouldn't think were related, like improvements in sanitation, things like separating latrines and using wire screens. Those all contributed to the population explosion. It's a reminder that innovation is often about these unexpected convergences.
And he contrasts those with predictions that just, mismark completely. Like this idea that everyone will be flying their own personal airplanes. It just never happened that way. And the point is, it's hard to predict the future because so many different factors are at play, many of them non-technological, and it's almost impossible to foresee which technologies will actually take off or have these big societal impacts.
So what he's saying is, it's not about trying to guess the future. It's about paying attention, being aware of the possibilities, good and bad. He says that monitoring technology, looking for its potential social impacts, that's a key responsibility for business leaders.
And once you spot those impacts, what do? Well, the ideal scenario, according to Drucker, is to eliminate the negative impacts altogether. Even better if you can turn that process into a new business opportunity. But let's be real, that's not always possible. So where you can't completely eliminate the negative, he says you got to anticipate what's coming. Think about the regulations that might be needed, educate the public, be transparent, get ahead of the curve. Because if you wait until there's a scandal or a crisis, well, then you're just playing damage control. And he's very clear about this. Just relying on public relations to spin your way out of a mess, that's a losing strategy in the long run.
So be proactive, be responsible, be transparent. That's the message. Okay, let's move on. We've talked about technology. Now let's talk about those massive players in the global economy, the multinational corporations. Drucker tackles this head-on in his essay, Multinationals in Developing Countries, Myths and Realities. And the title itself suggests he's going to be challenging some common assumptions.
Absolutely. He comes right out and says that there are 4 major misconceptions about multinationals and their role in developing countries. And these myths, he says, they're held by both the supporters and the critics of multinationals. And these wrong ideas, they get in the way of effective policies and lead to all sorts of conflicts. So he sets out to bust those myths.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me. What's the first myth he tackles?
The first reality, as he calls it, is that with the exception of those industries that are tied to a specific location, like those extracting natural resources developing countries, they're generally not the big money makers for your typical multinational corporation. Not for those focused on manufacturing, distribution, or finance, at least not in the 20th century. He's saying if all those operations in developing countries just vanished, most multinationals wouldn't even notice a blip on their global balance sheet.
So this whole image we have of multinationals exploiting developing countries for cheap labor, raking in huge profits, it's just not accurate, at least not according to the data he was looking at back then.
Not really, no. And the second myth he tackles is this idea that the main thing developing countries need is capital, financial investment. He's saying, yeah, money's important, but it's not the magic bullet. What they really need is the capacity to generate and effectively use their own capital domestically. And that, combined with imported technology, that can have a huge multiplier impact, meaning it sparks further economic activity and development. And he uses the examples of Japan and Canada, two countries that followed very different paths to development but were both successful.
Okay, how did those two approaches differ? What's the lesson there?
Japan, they focused on mobilizing their own domestic capital, and then they went all in on importing technology from abroad. Canada, they were more strategic about it. They channeled foreign capital into specific sectors, things like manufacturing and mining, but then they really nurtured domestic capital in those service-based industries like distribution and finance. And the result was both countries achieved rapid development, but Canada did it with a comparatively smaller reliance on foreign investment.
So there are different paths to development, and it's not just about getting as much foreign money as possible. Makes sense. What's the third myth he debunks?
The third myth is that multinationals alone can, single-handedly create development. He uses this great analogy. He says they're like the crank, but not the car. They're a necessary component, but they're not the engine that drives the whole thing. So just focusing all your energy on fighting against multinationals, well, it's missing the point. Just like relying solely on foreign investment to kickstart your economy, it's not going to work. You need a more holistic approach.
All right, so it's about building the whole car, not just focusing on one part. Makes sense. What about the fourth and final myth?
This one's interesting. It's this widespread belief that multinationals, they're always shifting production around the globe, chasing cheap labor, and that this is somehow a threat to developing countries. But Drucker, he flips that on its head. He says this global allocation of production, it's actually a potential advantage, a trump card for developing countries. Think about it. Multinationals, they can help level the playing field when it comes to things like capital and management resources, right? But labor, the thing developing countries often have in abundance, well, that's not as easily moved across borders. So this rational allocation of production globally, it can actually benefit developing countries. It gives them access to developed country management skills, marketing expertise, finance, all that stuff. And it helps integrate their productive capacities into the global economy.
So instead of seeing multinationals as the enemy, he's saying maybe they're part of the solution if we approach it the right way.
Exactly. Now, he does acknowledge that most of these multinational corporations, they're headquartered in a handful of developed countries. So developing nations, they don't have a ton of direct influence on their decision-making. But he still sees the rise of a truly global economy facilitated by these multinationals as the best hope for a lot of these smaller developing countries, especially those that might not be economically viable on their own.
And he points out that the next couple of decades, they were going to be crucial because developing countries were facing the surge in their workforce, lots of young people entering the labor market. But at the same time, developed countries were seeing their workforces shrink. So he's saying those investments from multinationals, their technology, their management know-how, and especially their access to global markets, that's going to be essential for creating jobs in those developing countries.
A very different perspective than what you usually hear in this whole debate about globalization. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Economics, the environment, technology, multinationals. Now let's talk about something a little closer to home, something that probably affects anyone working in an organization, especially in the public sector. Management by objectives, better known as MBO.
Ah, yes, MBO, the three letters that strike fear into the hearts of managers everywhere. But Drucker, he seems to have a particular take on this. In his essay, What Results Should You Expect? A User's Guide to MBO, he focuses specifically on public service institutions. What's he getting at there?
Well, he starts by saying that public service organizations, they're different from businesses in some key ways. They're often much more complex, more diverse. And their primary resource isn't money, it's people. And the outcomes, the things they're trying to achieve, Well, those are often intangible. You can't always measure them easily. And that makes it harder to stay focused on results.
Right.
And it also makes them more prone to what he calls bureaucracy, that tendency to mistake the process, the paperwork, the procedures for actual achievements.
So he's saying that while public service organizations desperately need that results-oriented approach that MBO promises, they're also more likely to fall into the trap of just going through the motions of MBO without actually achieving anything meaningful.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he outlines 7 key results that you should expect from a properly implemented MBO system in a public service setting. And the very first one is this. A lot of these agencies, they don't actually have clearly defined objectives. They have these nice-sounding mission statements, full of good intentions. But those aren't operational goals. They're not concrete things you can actually translate into work assignments. So step 1, he says, is figure out what your objectives should be in the first place. What are you actually trying to achieve?
And the second result he talks about is understanding that public service objectives, well, they're inherently messy. They're often ambiguous, they can contradict each other, and they're usually multiple objectives all tangled up together. And he uses this example of a hospital, which seems pretty straightforward, right? But even there, things get complicated. What exactly is their mandate? Is it healthcare in general? Or is it just treating sick people? What about prevention? What's the relationship with private doctors? What about maternity services? It's not as clear-cut as you might think.
And then there's the third result, which is recognizing that sometimes even perfectly valid objectives, well, they can clash. They can be incompatible. He uses this example of American farm policy. The rhetoric is all about protecting small family farms, but then the actual policies often promote large-scale efficiency, which ends up hurting those smaller farms. And Drucker's point is, MBO forces you to acknowledge this reality. There's rarely a single perfect objective. You're going to have to make tough choices, balance competing priorities, and accept that there will be trade-offs.
Okay, so MBO is about making those hard choices, not pretending they don't exist. What's the fourth result?
This one's crucial. It's about setting priorities, but also posteriorities. And that means deciding what you're not going to do. What initiatives are you going to postpone or even just scrap altogether? And he makes this point. Postponing something, it often means abandoning it. You've got to be strategic about your timing. Sometimes doing something late is just as bad as not doing it at all. And he advocates for this really tough question. If we knew then what we know now, would we even have started this project in the first place? And if the answer is no, then you got to be willing to pull the plug quickly and cleanly. Set a deadline, have a plan, and move on. This goes against the grain, especially in large organizations where there's this tendency to confuse size with strength and activity with performance.
So it's about being strategic, not just busy. What about the fifth result?
This one's about measurement. How do you actually know if you're achieving your objectives? Drucker pushes back against this idea that intangible outcomes, the kind you often deal with in public service, that they can't be measured. He says, look, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. You're just throwing money at a problem without knowing if it's having any effect. So you got to define your desired outcomes clearly, and you got to figure out a way to objectively assess whether you're actually achieving them.
So measurement matters, even when things are fuzzy. Okay, result number 6.
This one's all about feedback. You got to build it into the system. Not just once-a-year performance reviews, but ongoing, organized feedback that leads to regular review and continuous improvement. You're constantly tweaking your objectives, your roles, your priorities, how you allocate resources. It's a never-ending cycle. And that's one of the key outcomes of a well-implemented MBO system.
So it's not a one-time thing, it's a way of life. All right, last but not least, what's that 7th and final result he mentions?
This one's interesting. It's about management itself. He's saying for MBO to work, management has to achieve certain things as well. First, they need to foster an environment where people understand complexity, where it's okay to disagree, to have different viewpoints. He gives examples of leaders who encourage dissent, like Harold Ikes and Henry Wallace. And he talks about the Japanese system where there's this intensive deliberation before any decision is made. It's about getting all the perspectives on the table. And then it's about cultivating responsibility, getting people to buy into the goals, not just going through the motions. And all of this has to inform your personnel decisions, how you structure jobs, who you promote, all of that. And ultimately, MBO, as Drucker sees it, it's not just about problem solving. It's about problem finding, recognizing issues before they become crises, preventing problems from happening in the first place. It's a mindset. It's the core of planning and managing. It's how you make decisions, set priorities, design your organization. And it's all about getting people aligned towards shared goals.
So it's a pretty profound rethinking of MBO, going way beyond just filling out forms and checking boxes. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about another big topic, one that's often misunderstood. Scientific management, efficiency, time motion studies, all that stuff. Drucker wrote this essay, The Coming Rediscovery of Scientific Management, and that title suggests he thinks it's been unfairly dismissed or maybe even demonized.
That's exactly his point. He starts by introducing Frederick Taylor, the father of scientific management. And right away, he addresses the common misrepresentations. He says, look, Taylor's core belief was that improving productivity, doing work the right way, that ultimately leads to higher wages and a better life for workers. It's not about squeezing more work out of people for less pay. It's about making work better for everyone.
And he makes it clear that Taylor wasn't naive about motivation. He knew money wasn't the only thing that mattered to workers.
Right. He points out that Taylor understood way back then that while higher pay doesn't guarantee a motivated workforce, being unhappy with your wages is a surefire way to kill motivation. And Taylor, he was laser-focused on the task itself, breaking down every job into its individual components, analyzing each step, and figuring out the most efficient way to do it, what he called the one best way. And it wasn't about making people work faster. It was about finding smarter ways to work so you could achieve more with the same or even less effort.
So not just working harder, but working smarter. That's a key distinction. And what about this idea of functional foremanship? That sounds a bit like micromanaging.
It's actually not.
Yeah.
Drucker explains that this was Taylor's version of what we now call matrix organization. The idea is you have different supervisors who specialize in different aspects of the work.
Yeah.
So you're not just reporting to one boss who's trying to manage everything. It's a more flexible, more specialized approach. And it's a far cry from that traditional hierarchical structure, the pyramid with the big boss at the top.
So a more modern, more collaborative approach to management.
Interesting. And Drucker emphasizes that Taylor's primary focus was on productivity itself. Not just profits, not just cutting costs. It was about finding the most efficient, most effective way to get things done. And he was actually quite critical of the way most companies were being managed back then. He didn't think they were very good at it.
No, he didn't. And this is where things get really interesting. Drucker points out this huge disconnect between what Taylor actually said and did and how he's been portrayed, often very negatively. He calls it flying in the face of ignorance. And his argument is, Taylor was actually way ahead of his time. He understood things that most managers back then, and even many today, just didn't get.
So why this disconnect? Why has Taylor been so misunderstood?
Drucker says it's because people heard what they expected to hear. They were looking for confirmation of their own biases. They saw Taylor as this symbol of,